In this video, we're going to be taking a look at how 2D arrays work, and we're going to be doing that by building a simple treasure hunting game. This is going to be in console, and this is so you can see how 2D arrays work. So here's the objective of this lesson. We're going to create a treasure hunting game by implementing 2D arrays. Yes, more than one. The board's going to be 10 by 10. We can really make it any size we want it to be, but 10 by 10 is a good starting off so you can see how 2D arrays work. If you want to make it bigger later on, you can. Now, there will be 4 treasures. For testing purposes, we're going to choose the 4 treasures on the map where we want them to be. By the end, once we've tested our program and see that it's working, what we're going to do is we're going to allow the computer to choose 4 random locations. That way the game's different every time we play. Now, a user should be able to select a row and column that they want to search. And the board should update with locations searched, including places where there are no treasure, so where they've searched where there is no treasure, and places where treasure was found each turn. So every time they take a turn, it should show whether treasure was there or not, and places that still need to be searched. Now, each of those should be represented by a symbol. For the places that have not been searched, we're going to represent by a question mark. For places that have been searched with no treasure, we're going to do with a capital O to simulate a hole that they dug that was empty. And then for treasure that was found where they did search, we're going to do with an X, similar to like an X marks the spot. Now, 2D arrays work just like a table or a grid. A 1D array is simply a list. A 2D array allows you to implement a table or chart. And if you think of it like that, it's a lot easier to understand. It does have an X-axis and a Y-axis. So for example, say we're looking in a 2D array and we want the information in row 3, column 5. That means it would be stored right here. If our 2D array has 10 columns and 10 rows, there's 100 spots that we can store information in. So this game, by doing a 10 by 10, there's 100 places that the treasure could be. Making it any larger could get a little overwhelming for the user, but 10 by 10 is a good place to start. Now, because this can be a little overwhelming for if you're new to 2D arrays, we've broken it down into 7 steps for you. That way you can kind of focus strictly on what each part does. The first part is something you're probably very familiar with, and that's declaring variables. After we declare our variables, we're going to reset all the treasure and search locations to false. Now in VB.NET, it will automatically set it to false for you, but we're going to go ahead and code it in case you're using another language where that doesn't happen. That way, if you have to write pseudocode for an exam, they're going to expect you to write on it, even if you're using VB.NET. So you need to set them all to false. We'll go over how to do that. We need to make the board. We need to set the test treasure because we're going to be setting the treasure ourselves. Then what we're going to do is we need to write the part where the user can search the board. Then we need to update the board, showing the user the X where they found treasure, zeros where they missed the treasure, question marks where they still can search. And then we need to go back, and once our program's working, we need to set the treasure so it's random. So what we're going to do is we're going to flip over to VB.NET 2019. We're going to be working in console, and we're going to be using the .NET framework. So let's go ahead and switch over to VB.NET 2019 now. Okay, so like I said, we're in VB.NET 2019 console.NET framework edition. The first thing we need are some variables. So the first thing we're going to need is J. Now the reason we're doing J, my caps lock is on. The reason we're doing J as integer is because when you run a nested for loop, and usually do when you're working with a 2D array, you can't do for i equals 1 to 10, for i equals 1 to 10 on the next line. You have to do a different one. Now in Visual Basic, .NET or VB.NET 2019, you don't need to declare J. It's understood that that can be used, but it doesn't do that in all languages. And like I said, if you're taking a test and you're writing pseudocode or actual code, you're going to need to include that. So then we need the treasure. Now this is how you set up a 2D array. This would be a 1D array, right? Well, all you got to do for a 2D array, that would be the rows. Now we want to write how many columns. So 10 rows, 10 columns, and we're going to do this as Boolean. And our treasure variable shows where there either is treasure or there's not, one or the other. That's why it's Boolean. Treasure is either in the location or it isn't. Then what we need to do is we need to allow the user to search a row. We also need them to be search a column. So that's why we have those two variables. Now we also need to determine whether they've searched a spot or not. And the reason we need to know whether or not they've searched a spot is so we can put a question mark, an X, or an O. And that's why it's Boolean. They either have searched there or they haven't. And then what we need is found, because there are going to be 4 treasures. And once found equals 4, we know we have found them all. And then we're going to record their return as an integer. Now we need to set both of these to 0 because as soon as the program loads, both of them are going to be 0. So what we need to do first, now that we've declared all our variables, moving right along, we need to set all the treasure and search locations to false. So we're going to use a nested for loop, and we're going to work with the 2D array. So if you're unsure how a 2D array works, we're going to go through it right now. So for I equals 1 to 10, and the reason for I equals 1 to 10 is because there are 10 rows. Now I need to work with the columns. Well, that is going to be for j equals 1 to 10. If I type in I here, and you'll see what I'm talking about, it's going to come up with an error, and there's the error right there. So that's why you have to use j. You can't use I and I again. Now what we're going to do is we're going to do search ij equals false, treasure ij equals false. And if you're saying to yourself, I have no idea what's going on, no problem. So here, let's go ahead and run through this. Keep it simple. For I equals 1 to 10, the first time this I loop runs, it's going to have j run 10 times. So what that means is for I equals 1, search I, that's going to be search 1, comma, for j equals 1 to 10. So that's going to be 1, comma 1 equals false, treasure row 1, column 1 equals false. Then we hit this next statement. J is not done. So when it goes back, it increments by 1. J now becomes 2, but we're still on the first I for loop. So now it's 1, comma 2 equals false, 1, comma 3 equals, or 1, comma 2 equals false. Then it goes back, because J is not 10 yet, and then it increments to 3. So 1, 3 equals false, 1, 3, all the way to 10. So then by the time it gets done, it'll say 1, comma 10 equals false, row 1, column 10 equals false. Then, now that j has reached 10, we hit this next. I has not hit 10, so it increments. Now I is going to be equal to 2. J 1 through 10 is going to run again. So the first time it runs, it's going to be search row 2, column 1 equals false, treasure row 2, column 1 equals false. Then j is going to increment to 2. So now we have row 2, column 2 equals false. Then j increments to 3, row 2, column 3, all the way to 10, and then it keeps repeating. So just really 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 lines of code will allow you to set up the entire board. Once we do that, we need to set the treasures, which is our next step. Now you'll see this red line here, and that's because that procedure or sub does not exist. So we need to create it. So we're going to do set treasures, and then that red line goes away. So inside our set treasure, all we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and pick 4 generic locations to test our program. So what we're going to do is we're going to do treasure row 1, column 1. We're going to set that to true. And then we're going to set row 2, column 2 to true. And then row 3, column 3 to true. And then row 4, column 4 to true. Now, if we run this, nothing is really going to happen yet. It's just going to be a blank screen. So once we run into this line, it's going to set the treasure. After we set the treasure, the next thing we need to do is make the board. And if we make the board here, we'll see there's a red line. So we need to create a sub for that. Now, while I'm typing this up, the reason we are making individual procedures or subs for this is so if there's an error, we can go right to that sub where the error is occurring. We don't have to worry about trying to search through all the code to find our error. By breaking it into simple steps or separate procedures and subs, makes it really easy to find the errors if there is an error. So now we're going to make the board. To make the board, we're going to use a nested for loop, and when we're making the board and initializing the board, we need all those question marks. So how do we do that? Well, we know for a nested or for a 2D array, we need a nested for loop. Now, here's what we need to do. We need to do console.write, because when it runs the first time, it's going to be row 1, column 1. What do we want inside that? We want a question mark. But then when J runs again, we don't want to go to a new line. We want to stay on that same line. And what that will do is, next to the question mark, it'll put a space and a question mark, which will make it a lot easier to read. Now, we don't want the line to go on forever. We don't need 100 question marks in a row. Once we get 10 of those question marks, we need to go to the next line. So here, I'm going to insert a console.write line. And what this will do is it will take it to the next line. I don't need to write anything on that line. It's just going to take it to the next line. Because if I do not, I'm just going to have 100 question marks in a row. That's not a table or a grid. That's just a long line of question marks. By doing write line, after we write 10 question marks in a row with a space, question mark, we put a space and another question mark. After we get 10 of those, we want to go to the next line. And that's why that is here. So every time it runs, it's going to insert 10 question marks and do the next line. So what we're going to do is we're going to save here. We're going to run our program and make sure it's working properly. And you can see that it is working properly. We have a space. It's a little easy to read. If you want to put an additional space, you can. Just keep track of how many spaces you have before the question mark. Because remember, we're going to be replacing the question mark with either an X or a circle if they have found treasure or not. So now that we have made the board and we've displayed it to the user, we need to allow them to search the board, which means we're going to have another sub. And subs are procedures. And so if you hear the term procedure, is basically a sub which does not return a value. Functions do. There are no functions in this program though. So the first thing we need to do is update the turn, because when they search the board, it's going to be the first turn. We need to ask them to enter a row to search, because we need to know what row, and that is why we created the search row variable. And we're going to simply read what they type in and put that in the search row. And then what we're going to do, we also need to know the column to search. And we're going to put that into search column. And this is why it's nice or better to name variables that have to do with what you're working with, rather than A, B, C, D, E, and so on. Now, once they've searched, we need to check to see if there's treasure in that location. So if treasure, search row, search column, and that's what they typed in. So if they're searching, if they type in they want to search row 1, they want to search column 1, this will be if treasure 1 equals true, then we need to update that they've searched here. And there's a couple different ways to do this. There's always more than one way to solve a problem. Then we need to let them know that, yeah, you've searched here, you found treasure, treasure located. And then we need to update found. Found equals found plus 1, because they have found 1 treasure. There are 4 to find in this version. And then if found equals 4, then we'll let them know you have found all the treasure. And let's let them know how many turns it took. And we'll put that on a new line. And then we'll say it took you. And then we want to put a space. We need to add the turn variable. And we need to add another space, turns. We got to put the space because the next thing that's coming on this line is going to be the turn. If you leave U with no space, it's going to be YOU and then the number. So put a space. And that's why we put a space here, so it spaces out correctly. And then what we want to do is we want to pause the game, and then that's going to be the end of that end if. Now, there's one other option that they could do. We do search row, because they either found treasure or they did not. And if they didn't find treasure, then what we need to do, and yeah, that's not spelled right. Then what we need to do is we need to set this to true. And then let them know, hey, there is no treasure here. So that'll be that. Now, what we need to do also is after we do that, we need to go ahead and call our update board because they've searched. So now we need to update the board. Now, this is important. We need to make sure the game ends when they find all 4. If they find all 4 treasures and we tell them that and it takes them back to the board to search again, that's going to look unprofessional. So what we're going to do is we're going to do if found does not equal 4. Then what we're going to do is we're going to call update board and then end if. Now, you see a red line? Well, we know what that means. It means we need to create the sub. So let's go ahead and create the sub update board. And we are almost done. So when we update the board, what that will allow us to do is put in the question mark, the X's, and the O. So the first thing I want to do is I want to clear the screen because I want it to look nice and neat. They've inputted the row and the column they want to search. We need to clear the board. They don't need to remember which row and column they search. We're going to tell them that by an X, an O, or the places they still need to search. We don't want to see 6 different maps. We don't want to see 2 different maps. We want 1, so it looks like it's updating and refreshing. So we're going to clear the screen. And then what we're going to do is we're going to do our nested for loop for I equals 1 to 10. And remember, the reason I is 1 to 10 is because there are 10 rows. If we're doing 15 rows, it would be 1 to 15. And then, of course, for j equals 1 to 10 because there are 10 columns. So inside this code, we need to put the question marks and we need to put the O's and the X's. So let's start with if they find treasure. You can start with whatever you want. It doesn't matter. I'm starting with treasure. So if search, if they've searched the location, and I have to check every single location, and I can just do that using a for loop rather than, a line of code for each individual spot. So if they've searched there and the treasure is there, and the treasure is there by true, then I need to let them know that there is treasure. So what we're going to do is to make it a little easier to read, we're going to change the foreground color, and that we're going to change it to green. So this is how you change the text. It'll change it to green. And then what we want to do is we want to write. Now remember, we had a question mark, but they found treasure there. So we're changing that question mark to an X. Now, this is important. If you change the foreground color, you must change it back. If you do not, every single letter or character after you change the foreground color will stay in there. I only want the X to be green. Once it writes the X, that's fine. All I need to do is reset the color. Now, there is another possibility. The other possibility is that they search and do not find treasure. So if search ij equals true and there is no treasure in that spot, so that would be equal to false, there is no treasure, then what we need to do, and we're going to change the foreground color again, and we're going to change that to red. You can change it to whatever color you don't. We're not going to write a question mark. We're not going to write an X, because remember we had a question mark, but here they didn't find the treasure. We're representing that by a capital O, and then all we're going to do is reset the color because we don't want everything to be in red. Now, there's one other possibility, and that is they haven't searched there yet. And in that case, all we do is write our question mark, and we need to make sure we do this on every, once we get 10 question marks, 10 X's, 10 O's, combination of, that we move to the next line. And then after we run this, we need to search the board again. So that way they can see, okay, so this looks like it will take care of everything. We have our treasure that we set. So now what we're going to do is we're going to run and we're going to test it and make sure we're getting these 4 treasures, making sure they're showing up as X's. We're going to search some places where the treasure is not, hopefully get a red capital O, and everything else stays a question mark. So let's start with 1, 1. So row 1, column 1 is going to be right here. We should see this change to an X, and it does. Treasure is there. In row 1, column 2, there is no treasure. That should change to a red O, and it does. And because we're clearing the screen, it looks like this board's just updating. Really what we're doing is we're redrawing it every single time. And in console, that's something you have to do. So we know the treasure is in 2, 2. Let's try 2, 3. We get a red O. Perfect. Looks like it's working. And then 4, 4. Treasure located. You found all the treasure. It took you 6 turns. And then the program ends. Perfect. It is working. Now what we need to do is we need to make this a little more exciting and not very predictive. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back to our search treasures procedure sub, and we're going to comment this out just in case we need it later on. We may not need it later on, but just in case we change and increase the maximum size of our board, we can put those test conditions back in. And a lot of times programmers will put in test conditions and then all they will do is simply code it or comment it out so it doesn't run. Okay, so to make it random, there are a few variables that we need. The first one we need is we'll do a number, and that's going to be as a new random, and it's going to pick a new random number. And then we need something for the treasure row. T row sounds good. That's going to be an integer, and then T column. And then what we need is we need it to be valid. And we'll talk about why we need a valid in a minute, because this is going to need to loop repeatedly, but we need to make sure that the computer does not pick a place that's already been chosen. For example, if the computer picks row 5, column 5, they don't need to pick that again. Because if we're searching for 4 treasures, but it picks row 5, column 5 twice, we're only ever going to find 3. We can search every location. We have searched every location. There's only 3 treasures, and the game doesn't end. It's not going to know what to do. So we're going to prevent that from happening. Now, when we do that, we need to run a post-conditional loop. If you haven't seen our loop video, make sure you check it out. I'll put a link at the end. Post-conditional loop should be used when your loop is going to run at least one time. Our loop is definitely going to run at least one time. So let's go ahead and set T row and T column up to a random number. So we're going to do number.next 1, 11. We need a new number, the next number between 1 and 10. Now you may be saying, well, that says 11. Remember, if you've watched any of our other videos, you know that when you're dealing with random numbers, the first one is inclusive, the second one is exclusive, meaning it goes one below the maximum number you typed in. So if I wanted a number between 1 and 11, this would have to be 1 and 12. I don't want a number between 1 and 11. I need a number between 1 and 10. There are 10 rows, there are 10 columns. So I need to do the same thing here. Number.next 1, 11. Now the reason we have the same number.next is because it picks a random number based on the time and the date of your computer. If we have 2 different, like if I did this, if I did dim number 2 as new random, then, and I made this number 2, whatever this number picks, this number is going to be the same. So if it picks 1, it's going to be 1, 1, 2, 2, 3, 3, or 1, 1 again, 4, 4, 5, 5, 6, 6, whatever. We don't want it to do that. Well, the time will change by the time they enter a number and enter the next number. So we will definitely get 2 different random numbers, or so it works out well. Or by the time the computer picks a new random number, the time will change and we'll get another random number. So if you're working with random numbers and you have 2 random statements and wondering why are you getting the same numbers each time, that's why. If you're getting a random number, we've already stored it in T row. We can overwrite it and put it in a different variable, and then we can keep it saved. So we're going to do that. Now, we need to see if the treasure is there. So if treasure, T row, because we want to make sure there's no treasure there, equals false, then we need to put treasure there. So T row, T column equals true. That means it is a valid move, because the computer, if it's not valid, then we're not going to do valid equals valid 1 and we're going to loop until valid equals 4. And once valid equals 4, it'll exit the loop. So that should allow us to run the program. Now what we need to do is we need to find out if it's picking different treasures. So we're going to comment this out in a minute. For I equals 1 to 10, we're going to have the computer tell us where it puts the treasure. So if treasure, and it's going to check every spot by running this for loop, by checking every spot. If there's treasure there, then we're going to say treasure found at, and then what we need to do is we need to put I, and then let's see, let's put a comma so we can read it almost like a table, and J, and I think that will do it. So here's what we're going to do. Let's test our program. We're going to make sure the computer is going to pick different 4 different locations, because there are 4 treasures. So here, 2, 4, 3, 10, 7, 3, 7, 6. So let's check 2 and 4. Treasure is there, row 2, column 4. Let's check 1, 1, which was not picked this time. We commented that out, so it looks like it's working. I don't remember the other coordinates, but that is how you create a treasure hunting game using and implementing a 2D array. I hope you have a better idea of how 2D arrays work. There's lots of stuff you can still add to this game. You can add a game saving feature, which we did with the guessing game. It works the exact same way. Of course, the lower amount of turns would be a better score. If it took you, 4 turns, that would be a great score compared to it took you 80 turns. I'll link to that video as well. But if you found this helpful, please give it a like. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for future videos, please post a comment below, and we'll see you guys in the next video.